Okay, we are live.
Okay, Sid, are we good to go?
Mhm.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on another wonderful Better Together webinar. I'm Sarah Stewart. I am the Environmental Planning Manager at Plan RVA. The Better Together webinar series is a webinar series where we feature either different projects that staff at Plan RVA work on, projects or initiatives that partners across the region are working on, or other issues or projects that are related to the work that we do at Plan RVA. So you get to learn all about the region and different projects going on through these series of webinars. Today's webinar is going to be focused on hazard mitigation. Many of you may not know what that is. You're going to learn a lot about it today. So let's start off maybe with some introductions. We do have one more panelist that will join us in a few minutes, and we can, I'll mention him. We'll see if he pops on in the next minute. So again, I'm Sarah Stewart. I'm the planning manager with Plan RVA for the environmental program. Katie, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Katie Moody, and I'm the Regional Emergency Management Program Coordinator here at Plan RVA.
Okay, thanks. And Lee, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Lee Chapman. I'm a senior planner at Salters Creek Consulting, and we are doing the hazard mitigation plan update for Plan RVA and Crater PDC for 2022. So we're currently working on that.
Yes, thank you. So the panelist who should be arriving shortly, gotten a message from him, is Jay Ruffa. He is the planning director with Crater PDC. That is the PDC to the south of Plan RVA. It includes Petersburg, kind of the Tri-Cities area, all the way down to the North Carolina line. And we are partnering with them, we have in the past, and we are again, to update a multi-region, multi-hazard mitigation plan. So that is what we'll be talking about today. Why don't we start off just with a little bit of information about what even is a hazard mitigation plan? Why would you want to do it? And who is involved? Then we'll get a deeper dive sorts about hazards that you see in the Richmond and Crater regions from Lee. And that's all the analysis and data that we've been sifting through to learn about the risks that are posed in the region by various hazards. Then at the end, we're going to conclude with a little bit of dialogue that goes a bit deeper into why a hazard mitigation plan is a great idea and how there are there's a nexus between a hazard mitigation plan and various different other planning processes or projects or just initiatives that you see at multiple levels, be it local, be it state, be it federal. So, okay, first off, what's a hazard mitigation plan? So in many ways, it is a document, it creates a document, but I think that the focus should be on the process. It is a process through which communities engage staff and various, oh, it looks like Jay might be having trouble getting on. So if somebody could shoot him a link, that would be great. So it is a process through which communities work to identify various hazards that pose a risk and to say, okay, if we know that there are these hazards coming our way, what can we do to prepare ourselves to avoid damage and to mitigate that risk? And when I say hazards, what does that even mean? So a hazard could be a tornado. A hazard could be a hurricane. It could be a flood. It could be, you'll hear all about the different ones that we see in the Richmond region and Crater regions in a few minutes. But it is this process of different groups talking together, saying, okay, what does the data show is on the horizon or could be on the horizon, and how can we prepare for that? Each hazard mitigation plan, communities do hazard mitigation plans all across the United States, but each hazard mitigation plan is unique to the geography on which it is supposed to be focused. Hazards vary. The hazards in Richmond, Virginia are different than the hazards in Los Angeles, California. So, you know, it varies. Ah, we have Jay, it looks like. Hi, Jay. So, Jay, do you want to briefly, let's switch gears. Jay, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure.
I've mentioned you would be joining, but.
I'm Jay Ruffa. I'm the Director of Planning and GIS at Crater Planning District Commission. I basically do what Sarah does, but for the Crater Planning District Commission, just below. So we coordinate on a lot of these projects today, and that's part of our discussion is kind of some regional coordination between projects. So that's why I'm on board.
Yep. Thanks, Jay. Okay. I was just talking about what is a hazard mitigation plan and why would a community want to do it. So I said it's a process that does indeed create a document at the end, but in many ways the focus is on a process. So different groups of stakeholders work within a community to talk, to learn, to study the different hazards, talk about different actions that they can take over the next few years. And then the intention is that on an annual basis, that plan is then revisited, updated, and then again, you'll go through a larger update process. But it is in some ways intended to be this living document that you work from and that evolves over time as you learn more, as you do more. So who's involved? Local government staff, regional agency staff, state agency staff. Again, it's unique to the area, so different stakeholder groups could vary. It could be everyone from the Red Cross to a land conservancy, potentially even, to different, you know, social or welfare type agencies that might work with different people, from a school system to a housing authority to community colleges to universities. All of these are potential stakeholders in a community's hazard mitigation plan. I should note, even individual citizens, there is intentionally a public outreach portion of a hazard mitigation plan because everyone needs to understand what the hazards are, what's the risk they pose, and how can they either help themselves be prepared or help the community be prepared. And so why do we do it? Again, we'll get more into this in a little bit, but not only does it empower a community to know what might be coming and help prepare itself, but there are various funding streams for projects through the federal or state or other sources, through various sources, that if you have gone through a hazard mitigation planning process and identified a project as something that would help your community prepare, that you are then eligible to potentially receive. So there's one great reason why. So it helps you think about and it helps you potentially fund projects. Does anybody have anything, do any of our panelists have anything else to add about like what is, we'll also get into this, but what is a hazard mitigation plan and who's involved or that we should mention before we move on?
That was a good overview. I think the one thing I would add is that I do encourage communities to think beyond just what they know they have funding for and to think very broadly about activities for all the various hazards that they might even have an inkling of wanting to do in the future, whether or not they know of funding for that, because funding becomes available. Funding streams happen during the planning horizon.
That's a good point. You never know. So better be safe then. I'm sorry. Put it in there. Okay. Well, then are we potentially ready to transition? Lee, do you want to give your presentation about the hazards that we see and the risks that we see?
Certainly. Let me share my screen here quickly so you can see just a few slides on the current hazard mitigation plan that we're working on. Again, like I said, for the Richmond and Crater PDC areas. So this is a list of the 24 participating communities in this plan. We don't have a full list on a slide of all the different stakeholders that are involved because the stakeholder list is quite broad. As Sarah mentioned, it can include anything from citizens to community watch groups, American Red Cross, various state agencies, some federal agencies are represented among our stakeholders, and some of the Native American reservations in the area are also included. So we've tried to reach out to a very broad group of stakeholders, including some of adjacent communities from the other PDCs, just to make sure we get a broad look at the hazards and a broad look at the mitigation actions for those hazards. As Sarah also mentioned, this is more than just a plan that pops out at the end. This is a process that we go through. The process that we're using for this particular plan is based on FEMA's guidance. It's a 4-phase process, and there's 10 steps within that. We are currently, at the moment, this slide doesn't have the checked part for phase 2. Phase 2 is pretty much done, so you can check those boxes. We are in phase 3. We're beginning to, we've set the planning goals. We're beginning to draft the actual action plan, reviewing mitigation alternatives for each community and finalizing those mitigation actions for the next 5 years for all the 24 communities that are involved. So why do we update the mitigation plan? Sarah talked a lot about why we do a mitigation plan in the first place, and she touched on why we update it, but it's important to know that number one, we update it because we have to. The guidance from FEMA that makes communities eligible for certain federal funding streams for mitigation projects requires that the plan be updated every 5 years. It also requires that the plan be updated after a disaster. Well, we've all had a federal disaster declared for coronavirus, for COVID-19. So every single community in the United States should be updating their hazard mitigation plan right now. So it is required after a disaster or every 5 years, whichever comes first. I also see it as a great opportunity to integrate the plan into existing planning mechanisms. So if you update, I think in Virginia, the comprehensive plan has to be updated every 10 years. Is that correct? 10 years. So
Yes, sorry, I realized I was
okay.
mute.
Okay. So if you end up with a comprehensive plan update during the 5 years in which you're working on your hazard mitigation plan, you want to make sure that the next hazard mitigation update takes into account the new things that are in the comprehensive plan. Or if you have ordinance changes during that planning horizon, or other major community changes, the update to the mitigation plan allows you to incorporate those community changes, whether they're changes in capabilities, changes in hazards that affect you, all these different things that are listed here on the screen. All these things can change during that 5-year planning horizon. So it's important to update the plan every 5 years or after a disaster to make sure you capture those changes that happen during the planning horizon. So a little bit back to the specifics for the hazard mitigation plan for this region. The 2017 plan, which is the one that we're updating, contained this list of hazards that you can see here, with hurricanes listed as the most significant, going down to mass evacuation down there at the bottom, which was listed as a limited rank. It didn't have a very high rank, but it was seen as a hazard. So for 2022, we've reconsidered a few things. We've added, obviously, infectious diseases. We've added flooding due to impoundment failure, and this is one that's related to some FEMA requirements for high hazard dams. We had to add that as a specific hazard, call it out, and do some other specific things within the plan in order to be eligible for certain funding streams there for dams. We've included radon exposure. I'll talk about that just a little bit more in a moment. And then for each hazard, rather than do mass evacuation as its own individual hazard, we're examining 3 new things for each hazard. We're taking a look at the impacts of climate change on each hazard, taking a look at a social vulnerability analysis for each hazard, and taking a look at how each hazard could be impacted or could cause a mass evacuation. And so we've monkeyed around with mass evacuation just a little bit. I think this is more precise and shows how mass evacuation can either be generated by or impacted by each individual hazard. So I'm not going to go through the entire history of every single hazard that's happened in the past 5 years. I'm not going to go through all the results from every single hazard, but I want to give you a taste for how we've treated each hazard in the hazard identification and risk assessment portion of this hazard mitigation plan. This is by far the thickest part of the plan, the most labor intensive. I think, in my opinion, the most important part of the plan is actually the mitigation actions, which we're just starting to formulate for this plan. So I'm going to run through a little bit of the history and how we sort of put together parts of the hazard identification and risk assessment. But again, it's a very large part of the plan. So if you have specific questions on specific hazards, the best thing to do would be to consult the draft of the hazard identification and risk assessment portion. So for each hazard, we put together a table, if you will, or a description of each of the recent events. And so here you have a sampling of recent flood events that happened within the previous 5 years of the update. So there were at least two, I think there were 4 or 5, but I'm showing you 2 big flood events here. And I tried to include pictures or other information on the dollar value of damages to give folks a sense of how severe certain hazard events were. For flood risk in particular, we do concentrate a little bit more on flooding because it's one of the higher risk hazards within the region. We did sort of a multi-method approach here, if you will. For the first approach, we used HAZUS, which is FEMA's, how to put it, it's a software that allows us to take a building by building analysis of each structure in the region and what its risk to flood might be. HAZUS level 1 is a more broad-based description of those hazards on sort of a census block level analysis. And HAZUS level 2 is where we really were able to dig in some communities where there were detailed studies from FEMA, and we were able to take a much better look at the depth of flooding against each structure. When you can take a look at the known depths of flooding against a structure, you can start to estimate what the damages would be with each flood frequency. So we were able to do that for a large portion of the study area. So we have HAZUS level 1 for some communities and HAZUS level 2 for several of the communities as well. We also did a critical facilities analysis, which I'll show you an example of. We took a look at all the different critical facilities and how they stack up against various flood hazards. Are they vulnerable to storm surge? Are they vulnerable to riverine flooding or coastal flooding? Are they in the 500-year floodplain or the 100-year floodplain or the floodway? So we were able to take a look at various critical facilities like electrical power generation facilities, oh gosh, various different ones, water supply facilities, wastewater treatment plants, that kind of thing, taking a look at all of those versus the various flood hazards. And then we did a structure analysis, which is taking a look at the various claims under the National Flood Insurance Program. What's the coverage level look like? How many of the buildings are covered by flood insurance? How many have been flooded various times? So we did all these 3 different levels of analysis for each of the communities in the study area. Here's a sample of that flood risk assessment. This is the HAZUS level 1 communities. Again, this is just a taste of it. So you can see the predicted level of damages for various communities. Substantial damage is when structures are damaged by more than 50%. These dollar losses are broken out by building contents and inventory. Again, I'm just trying to give you a taste of the results for each of these analysis types. The critical facilities analysis. So these were 3 different areas that we took a look at related to flood for the crater community. So you can see how many communities have structures in the floodway. That might be areas we're identifying where a structure in the floodway that's critical to the operations of the community. We might want to take a look at this in the future as we start to develop mitigation actions. So this is a table we'll definitely come back to during the formulation of mitigation actions. This is a quick sample of the flood insurance analysis. How many policies does a community have in place? And then I like to take a look at the percent change. How has that number of policies changed in the last 5 years? I think that's an important element to look at in the update process. So for repetitive flood loss analysis, we did a GIS layer analysis. We took the floodplains for a community, So here the blue shows the 100-year floodplain for this flood town USA. And then we mapped out the single NFIP flood losses. So these green dotted properties are properties that have been flooded once, at least once, under the National Flood Insurance Program. Then we overlaid once. And then we overlaid the NFIP repetitive flood losses. So these are the properties that have had 2 or more losses in the history of the National Flood Insurance Program. So we're starting to see a pattern here where you can see structures that are in the 100-year floodplain that have been flooded multiple times. Then we added on the severe repetitive losses. Do we have some that have had a total of losses that equal or exceed the value of the structure? And wow, we have 3 of those within this as well. So that allowed us to then figure out where our repetitive flood loss areas are. And it's important to see where these polygons lie, because each of the polygons represents an area that has had repetitive flood losses. We cannot share the information that's shown by the dots with the public because that's protected by Privacy Act. But we can share these polygons with the public. And so that's what the plan has, is a series of repetitive flood loss areas shown within the plan. As I mentioned, we're also taking a look at social vulnerability for each of the hazards in the plan. And one way we did this was with the National Risk Index. This was the primary method we used. The National Risk Index is sort of a FEMA baby, if you will. It's brand new. It's something that I think it's been long in the making, and they've done it in cooperation with the University of South Carolina, and put together data on various factors that impact a family's social vulnerability. How many people are living in the house? Do they have access to a car? Various factors like living below poverty level, things such as this that impact a household's vulnerability to a hazard. This is a general social vulnerability map. This is not for a particular hazard. So what we would do with this social vulnerability information is then overlay the risk for various hazards on top of this map. And so when you look at the expected annual losses and the social vulnerability combined with factors regarding resilience, because some communities, some households can bounce back faster than others. I always use the example of a place down in North Carolina, I think it's Wrightsville Beach, where every single house in the community has been elevated. Every single critical facility in the community has been elevated. So they have a very high community resilience to flood because every structure is elevated above the 100-year flood level. And when a flood comes through or a hurricane comes through, it sweeps out everything that's underneath their house, and they have to go replace lawnmowers and a few landscaping logs. But basically the structures are not vulnerable. The community is resilient, so they have a high community resilience factor. So when you combine these 3 factors, you get a risk index, and it's specific to a hazard. So what we did for each of these repetitive flood loss areas, and you'll see the repetitive flood loss areas in pink with a black outline, several of those repetitive flood loss areas were rated as moderate or high risk for flood. And so we've highlighted that within the plan, focusing in on the repetitive flood loss areas that are at high risk for flood. That's what we'll do. And again, when we start to formulate the mitigation actions, we'll whip out this map and try to focus in on these high risk areas, high social risk areas for flood. And that'll allow us to hopefully make inroads and make changes in the future to social vulnerability to flood in the region. This is another use of the social vulnerability map. We used the base level social vulnerability map and put the high hazard dams on top of that. And so we were able to identify exactly which dams have socially vulnerable areas beneath the outfall. So this was yet another way that we used the social vulnerability to help isolate those facilities that we want to take another look at during the development of mitigation actions. A quick look here at another hazard, for example, this was tropical storms. These were the storms that had blown through the region or near the region since the previous plan. We took a look at the damages caused by those and other, not just damages, but other impacts to the region. We also developed for the plan a 100-year return period peak gust map. I think it kind of makes sense. You have the highest peak gusts for a 100-year storm out to the east, which is nearer the coast and nearer the ocean, where you're going to see the highest wind speeds. Just a quick blurb on radon exposure. A little bit here about what radon is. It's dangerous because you can't see it. It's colorless and odorless, and it's formed by radioactive decay by these various elements, uranium, thorium, and radium, underground. And so in Virginia, we see it mostly in granites and shales, but it's dangerous because you can't see it, and it will creep into a house, typically from underground, but also through well water, aeration of well water, through the shower, through cracks in the foundation, through a sump pump down in the basement. We see a lot of times the highest exposure to people is people who live in the basement or spend a lot of time in the basement of structures that have a high radon content. The main impact of radon is danger to the lungs. It starts to release the radiation within the lungs, and that causes lung cancer. So some researchers at the College of William and Mary asked us to take a little bit deeper dive into this. So we, dug up some of the existing information on radon. One of the most used maps with regard to radon is this 1993 series of maps that the EPA did for the entire country. And these maps, the folks at William and Mary are starting to throw some shade on these maps and say, well, maybe this isn't based on a whole lot of information. And when you start to look at the basis for this map, it was based on just a handful of tests, a small handful. The sampling was sample size was very, very small. And so they are interested in doing some more digging, taking a look at what they know about the Yorktown Yorktown Formation, and how the underlying geology of this region and the adjacent Hampton Roads region may be impacting the number of structures with radon, with high radon risk. And they've done a lot of detailed study here in the Williamsburg area. This is one of the maps they've created for sort of the downtown Williamsburg region. And they would like to expand this testing. This was a much larger sample size. They've been giving out radon kits and getting results back and mapping that risk. And so I think from this, you're seeing it's not just a geological, deep geological underlayment for this radon risk. It could be other things. It looks like a hydrologic map too, if you look at it. So, so they want to do some more tests. They want to take a look at this in more parts of the state. And this region was supportive of adding radon as a hazard to the hazard mitigation plan. So a little bit about what we found in the hazard identification risk assessment. This is about the overall results. So for each hazard, we tried to develop annualized damages. That's not real easy to do for things like sinkholes and infectious disease and shoreline erosion. It's really hard to put a quantifiable number on annualized damages for those. But for these other hazards, you can see that we were able to find at least something that gave us some confidence in average annual damages. A lot of times we were using the, it used to be called the NCDC, National Climatic Data Center. Now it's called the National Centers for Environmental Information. It's still out of NOAA, and NOAA collects information from emergency managers and weather watchers and other National Weather Service offices from all over the country. And they put together damages for each type of hazard, mostly natural hazards and mostly hazards related to weather. So you're going to find things like thunderstorms, tornadoes, droughts, earthquakes, but the NCEI data does not extend to things like wildfires, sinkholes, infectious diseases. And so that's part of the issue here, is that we don't see, our sources don't extend to some of these hazards that we know are risky in this region. We did get wildfire data from the Department of Forestry, the State Department of Forestry. So we were able to at least put some annualized damages on wildfires as well. I think we had data going back at least 20, possibly 30 years for wildfires. We went through an exercise with the committee that's working on this plan to rank the hazards. We put each one on this likelihood versus consequence matrix and determine where it was within this system. And then I used the results of this to put a number on each of these. So very rare was considered a 0, insignificant was a 0. So you can see how we use the XY coordinates to create a risk number based on consequence and score for each of these hazards. We did 2 other exercises with the group that helped give us sort of a qualitative analysis of where they thought each hazard was in relation to the other hazards with regard to high risk, moderate risk, or low risk. I took the results of all that feedback, and this is the presentation of the final hazard risk for the Richmond Crater region. We renamed a few of the hazards just a little bit. I know in some parts of the previous plan, it was called severe wind events. Other times it was called hurricanes. We decided to stick with severe wind events. We went back and forth on infectious diseases and whether to call that pandemic or communicable disease, but we stuck with infectious diseases for the most part. And then you can see high hazard dam flooding, sinkholes, radon, and landslides are in the negligible risk, but there's still a risk. There's still a recognized hazard in this region, so we weren't willing to disregard them. We still want to examine their impacts. The impacts have been noted in the hazard identification and risk assessment. All right, let me take a rejuvenating sip here. So for the updated goals and objectives. So when you go through a planning process, you can gather all the data you want, but you've got to have an analysis of where you want the plan to take your community in the future. And that's what we did with this updated goals and objectives. We went through the existing goals and objectives, which in my opinion were very emergency management oriented. We wanted to make sure that they were mitigation focused, make sure that they took the community down a path that decreased damages in the future, not just made them more prepared for hazards and emergencies, but decreased damage from those hazard events in the future. And so the group came up with a long set of goals and objectives. Each of these goals had about 3 or 4 objectives with it. So again, I'm just giving you an overview. So I wanted to tell you what the focus of each of those goals was. Goal number 1 was to protect the whole community. We want to do it equitably. We want to make sure that all different social groups are taken into account. Goal number 2 was to strengthen those partnerships for hazard mitigation. Listen to what Hampton Roads is doing. Listen to what Middle Peninsula is doing. Hear what the state's resiliency plan is all about. Make sure that you're reaching out and understanding how mitigation is happening in areas around you and bringing in those partnerships so that a larger group of stakeholders has buy-in in what you're doing and buy-in in your successes. Goal number 3, encourage sustainable government practices. This had several objectives related to it, but I think the focus here was health, safety, and welfare of citizens, making sure that that all the citizens had safe housing before, during, and after any kind of hazard event. And so that's related to something like radon. Each of the hazards, each of the mitigation actions will be related to one of these goals and objectives. So we'll make sure when we present each mitigation action that we tell you which goal, 1, 2, 3, or 4, it helps fulfill. And then goal 4 was protect critical infrastructure. One of those things is the high hazard dams, but there was also the region has had some success with creating partnerships among utility providers and things like water provision, wastewater treatment, and trying to make sure that the region as a whole can maintain all those services throughout hazard events successfully. And so that takes partnerships, and that takes, I think the word partnership is used both in goal 2 and in one of the objectives for goal 4, creating those partnerships that help, excuse me, that help strengthen the whole mitigation program. Our next step, we've already got most of the communities examining their own capabilities. I will review all those capabilities, and we'll start to make some recommendations for looking at a community's current situation, understanding their capabilities, and then figuring out what action is required to get them where they want to be. We have goals for the whole region, but each community is going to have to figure out how they can get from where they are, their current situation, to the goals that we've set for the whole region. It's going to be different for each community. They have various financial capabilities. They have various political capabilities, various staffing levels, all these things that can impact how much success they can find in implementing those goals. But we're going to do our best to do sort of a bridge analysis and figure out what it takes to get them from current situation to meeting those goals. And that's what a capability analysis is all about. So very briefly, the next steps, we're getting ready to, in fact, we were exchanging emails on it today with this gang. We're trying to figure out when our last work session is going to be. And that will be a work session about general mitigation action types, what communities should be looking for when they analyze their existing mitigation actions, and what ideas they might have or we might have to help them create new mitigation actions for the coming 5 years. We're then going to have some sit-down sessions, I'm going to call them office hours, with each community to kind of help them work through the mitigation actions and write them out in a little bit more detail, give me some more guidance on how to put those in the final plan. We'll be having a final public meeting. It says plural on here, but we'll probably have one virtual public meeting on the final plan in late fall, early winter of 2021. And then we're going to submit this whole package to VDEM and hope for their approval. Any changes they might require, we'll make those and then submit to FEMA just as quickly as possible and push FEMA to approve it with a target date of the first communities adopting in April or May of 2022. And then hopefully all of the communities will have it adopted by August of 2022. And we will have our final plan, submit to FEMA, and get that final letter of approval. So that is my summary, and I am open to questions or additional concerns you may have, Sarah.
No, that was good. That was good. Thank you, Lee. Here, let's stop share. Can you stop sharing your screen just so we can all get big again on our, thank you. Okay. And that was very good. I'm peeking in the chat and I don't see anything, but we'll also have time, everybody, towards the end for a little bit of Q&A. Yep. So, that was good. As you can see, everyone, a hazard mitigation plan is a very large effort. It is an all-encompassing, very deliberate, very, honestly, even the planning process is longer than many that you see kind of in the planning sphere. Very intentional. There's guidance out, like kind of official guidance from FEMA about what you should do, how you should do it, what you need to include, and then just kind of also encouragement to be as broad and bold and big as you can be. So that is what we are trying to do. So now I think maybe let's just dialogue a little bit about what kind of funding opportunities. Katie, maybe you could even start off by saying, everybody, you heard Lee mention how the hazard mitigation plan, or especially the 2017 plan that we're in the process of updating, the mitigation actions are very tied to emergency management. And so that is true. The emergency management community is the critical component of updating a hazard mitigation plan and then enacting it and carrying it forward. But Katie, would you like to talk a little bit about more about the emergency management community and even what is EMACI or the Alliance if people are not familiar with it?
Sure. I'll start with the Alliance part first to give some background context. So my position at Planner RVA, as I mentioned before, this Regional Emergency Management Coordination. So I work specifically with the Emergency Management Alliance in Central Virginia. And that group is comprised of 25 localities that make up VDEM Region 1 And it includes the Plan RVA and the crater regions, but also a few additional localities kind of on the outside. It's a pretty large footprint, actually. So, of course, not all those localities participate in the hazard mitigation plan for Central Virginia, but a vast majority do. So we have a pretty large group of our stakeholders and partners that participate from the emergency management realm. And traditionally, in past round, I guess, updates of the plan or developments of the plan have kind of been traditionally championed by the emergency managers. They've kind of been the, I guess, primary advocates and champions and kind of lead planners or assisting with the kind of development of the mitigation actions and some of the plan items themselves. Sarah, I think that's kind of what you were asking.
Yes,
And
yeah.
of course, and they're definitely playing a big role in the process this time around. And I think Lee made a good point, in her presentation that we're changing quite a few of the hazards from the 2017 plan. And that was intentional, not just because we have other hazards that affect our region, maybe more so than a couple of years ago. We're trying to explore, what other hazards affect the area, but traditionally the plan's been very response focused, and that maybe is attributed to the fact that emergency management's played such a big role. So we're trying to maybe shift it to a more interdisciplinary plan that could benefit, many more planning groups other than emergency managers. So of course they play a big role. We have an alliance planning committee that kind of also helps serve as like a tactical advisory committee in a way. And then we have a planning chair, and she participates in quite a few of the meetings, who kind of give their expertise and opinions on different parts of the plan and, how we're changing things and things like that. So they still do definitely play a big role, and even, from the beginning and all the way through the plan approvals and getting those approvals to their boards. And, some of those localities are a lot smaller, whether they're towns or more rural areas that need a lot more assistance with facilitating communication and input and things like that. So they play a big role in that as well, getting their mayor involved and
Right.
just kind of, keeping all the players that, to have, equitable input and things like that. So they definitely play a big role in that. And just the fact that they're so cohesive, that the group themselves are great at working together. So I think that definitely gives us a good backup and kind of backbone to just get kind of making sure we've got the right people, in the meetings and the workshops and things like that. So I hope I answered your question the way you wanted.
I think that was a good summary of some of the background and the backbone that the emergency managers can provide throughout this process and the history that they have with the plan and with the planning process in the region.
And of course, VDEM is the one who is facilitating the grant that that provides the funding for this. And we work very closely with them throughout the plan process, from the application through the plan approval. So, they're already heavily involved in that as well.
Absolutely. But Katie, you also mentioned that that a hazard mitigation plan is increasingly and encouraged by FEMA to be a broader process than it may have historically been. And we have definitely gotten that feedback from FEMA this go round, both from the beginning throughout. And so there is a nexus of hazard mitigation planning with comprehensive planning, like Lee was mentioning, with some resiliency planning that you see at the state and federal level. Jay, do you want to touch on
I do.
some aspects of resilience? Okay.
So you probably picked up in Lee's presentation when she talked about kind of what's new. And we looked at climate change as something being new that affected all the different hazards. So that kind of theme of climate change and or resilience to environmental changes in our living environment is coming down in multiple programs. So first off, it's coming through the hazard mitigation plan. Secondly, I know it's in our transportation plans that affect the region. Both Richmond Regional's transportation plan and the Tri-Cities MPO transportation plan are now mandated in their transportation planning to have resilience built into their plan. And to take that a step further, resilience planning for the state of Virginia, especially in the coastal zone, has been brought to a forefront with Virginia's coastal resilience master plan. So Virginia has been in about a 2-year, not quite a 2-year, 18-month process to roll out its first coastal resilience master plan. It's due to be open to the public here November, I think. And it's a big step forward for Virginia, but it's the first plan that specifically says resilience, but it ties into these other plans that I mentioned through that resilience core and through flooding especially. So it just looks at it through a slightly different lens. It looks at it through coastal flooding. Also, it will expand this coastal resilience master plan, Virginia coastal resilience master plan. It will also expand after its first iteration to include flood and flood resilience for the whole state. So even though it's named Coastal Resilience Master Plan, the state had to start somewhere, and it kind of made sense to start with the coast, which is receiving more inundation and more flooding due to sea level rise and more recurrent storms and more runoff because of those current storms. And so this plan starts to look at that. But what's really nice is it starts to kind of give us a framework to bring these 3 types of plans and probably others in the future together. So we can bring in the hazard mitigation planning, we can bring in comprehensive planning, we can bring in coastal resilience planning, and we can bring in transportation planning, all under this lens of resilience. And so that's kind of a really important thing happening in the state right now, which allows us to use multiple plans to kind of leverage to get projects done. So for example, if a community has a project that's in a hazard mitigation plan, that is also a resilient project that might be a transportation plan, you now have 3 different funding sources that you could potentially tap to get a project done. Not to say that you would get all 3 or that it actually checks all the boxes for all 3, but potentially you could. And that allows a locality the opportunity to get funding from multiple sources. So just to kind of stick on two of those plans, in the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan, what has been set up also for the state is the Virginia Community Flood Preparedness Fund. And Virginia now participates in what's called RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which basically is an auction for carbon credits. And the proceeds come into Virginia, and they've been earmarked by legislation to go into coastal resilience planning projects. And there's a set litigation that I'm not going to read through that awards how the money can be spent. But the first round, we're in the middle of a second round already, but the first round of grants awarded already $7.8 million to over 19 different projects. So there's money to be had for resilience projects. Now, if it doesn't quite fit in straight coastal resilience, this is where hazard mitigation planning comes into effect. On the federal level, if your projects well, I should just say projects, fit into your hazard mitigation planning, you can also apply for BRIC funding. BRIC is kind of the federal version of funding for hazard mitigation planning, like the Community Flood Preparedness Fund is a local or for state resilience initiatives. And so BRIC funding is, again, it stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And so it's FEMA's way of saying, how can we start looking at these hazards that we know are going to occur and know could potentially occur in the future, and how can we change the way we build our community so that it's naturally more resilient, kind of as insurance, so it doesn't cost as much in the future. So to go back to Lee's example in her presentation about the beach having all of their critical infrastructure risen on stilts because of storm flooding. So that would be a way to build resilience within that community. And so we're really at an exciting time for planning, because as communities look at this, if they can look at a larger picture of what do we have? Do we have a comprehensive plan? Do we have a resilience plan? Can we use the state plan for resilience? Can we use the hazard mitigation plan? And then in our traffic planning, are we in one of those areas that can leverage that? Now you have multiple funding mechanisms and sources to get stuff done in your community. So that's kind of really what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good. Lee, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great point, and it's something that I will try to pull out as we go through this final stage of identifying mitigation actions. One thing I'll ask each community to think on, and I will then write about, is how they have married those plans over the last few years. So, and it goes both ways. You don't just see mitigation actions or mitigation goals and objectives being echoed in a comprehensive plan. You might see it the other way around.
Right.
Yeah, flip it on its head. And how do the local ordinances reflect what's in the comprehensive plan and the mitigation plan? And so a lot of times mitigation actions, when they're implemented, can have sort of rippling effects. If it changes something in the comprehensive plan and it changes something going forward in the hazard mitigation plan. I'm not stating this very well, but there's ways that these plans marry together. And I think, FEMA loves to see that. I'm sure that the DCR folks, when they're looking at the resilience plans, are going to like to see that. If you can pull actions for the resilience plan that were previously identified in your mitigation plan, they start to see that these are really important to the community. And I think the other point I wanted to make that Jay alluded to is, these funding streams that we're seeing that just popped up, this Coastal Resilience Fund, that popped up during the planning horizon from 2017 to 2022. There are private funding streams that, I know the city of Norfolk has made use of some private funding streams, or these 100 resilient cities.
100 is the resilient cities.
Yeah, and, so things like that, they do pop up. And so really encouraging communities to think broadly about mitigation actions. I've heard so many planners come to the table and say, well, we really want to do X, Y, and Z, but we've taken Z off the table because we know it's just not going to be funded by our council. I'm like, no, put it in there. Put it in there. Make this your wish list. This is your Santa Claus wish list for mitigation. You want to put it all in there and see what Santa delivers on in the next 5 years.
You never know.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Lee said. Having it in there, having something to reference, it's always better to have it in there and never get to it than have funding and not be able to use your plan to back up the application for funding because you didn't have it in your plan. So that holds true for all of these plans we're talking about, our transportation plans, our resilience plans, and our hazard mitigation plans. If you have identified needs, keep all those identified needs on the table if possible.
Yes. For an example, the city of Richmond used the 2017 hazard mitigation plan, and I know the intention of them as well as other communities is to use the update of the hazard mitigation plan, this one in process, as part of their resilience plan that was then certified by DCR to access community flood preparedness funds. Richmond was awarded two grants for 2 projects. So there's an example of how, and their resilience plan was essentially composed of hazard mitigation plan, what I'm going to call either a watershed or a stormwater management plan, and their emergency operations plan. And then they kind of tied those together with this overview document, and that's their resilience plan. And I think that moving forward, they want to better integrate those things, but they were able to use these pieces and see how they all can connect, and we can kind of summarize how they connect. And they did get awarded funding. I mean, this is big, this is great. This is how it's supposed to work. And so that's why, no, you don't narrow your field of vision too early in the process. Don't
Yeah.
shoot yourself in the foot. So we can, if there are any, I'm looking in the chat, I don't see any questions, but Sid, if there are questions that either you know of or you can see somewhere, please let me know.
Not at the moment right now, but I can definitely keep an eye.
Okay, just let me know. One last thing that we haven't spent much time on, but that if we've got a few minutes, which it looks like we do, I was thinking might be worthwhile mentioning, because it does go along with everything we said, is that there are some communities in in the study area for the plan that are in the community rating system. And so if you don't know what the CRS program is, which is what you'll often hear it referred to, we are building into the planning process and into the plan elements that will support them in the community rating system. So the community rating system is something that goes along with the National Flood Insurance Program, and if a community is in the community rating system, it will reduce the price of the premium that the policyholder pays. The way that they enter into the system, and there's different levels, is that either through ordinances or other programs, they satisfy certain criteria. And there's all different ways that you can get different points. I know Lee knows more about it than I do, but there are different ordinances, there are different standards that you can put in place, there are different outreach and education efforts that you can undertake. There's lots of different ways, and you piece together these different ways to build up your points, and then policyholders within that locality would get a X% discount on their premiums. So
the big idea being that if communities do more than they have to for floodplain management to be in the National Flood Insurance Program, then the people who have flood insurance in that community reap the rewards.
right.
And so if you do more, you save more.
Right. And the idea is that it is this kind of self-reinforcing positive spiral of continually making it more resilient or more resistant.
Risk reduction.
Yeah. Yep. So that is great. There's one community that is in the process of joining CRS, but that is being taken into account, and that the hazard mitigation plan and planning process is a way through which a regional planning process can support a community in their own kind of goals and efforts that relate kind of back to that community, and in just general flood resilience across the landscape. Looks like we only have one more minute. I don't see any questions. Sid, is there anything? Sid, am I missing anything?
Nothing so far.
Okay. So we should probably just go ahead and tie this up since we have 1 minute. I would like to thank all of our panelists, and Lee, that was a fabulous presentation. Thank you. I think it covered everything great. If anybody has any questions out there for us, you can reach, well, all of us, you can reach all of us. You can easily reach me. If you go onto the planrva.org website, you can find us. Katie and I are under staff contacts. If you have questions, reach out. This is meant to be a planning process that integrates public input and that takes stakeholder input into account and factors everything together. So again, Lee, Jay, Katie, thank you so much for your participation in this. And I think, I hope everybody learned a lot more about hazard mitigation than when you showed up. So,
Thanks for having us on, Sarah.
yeah, thank you.
And thanks for facilitating, Sarah.
Mhm.
You did a good job too.
Thanks, guys. Thank
Thanks,
you
Sarah.
all. We're a good team, folks. Okay.
Yay.
I'm going to sign off.